thing clearly was bad, and they were caught off guard by the defunding thing, even though ACORN didn't get a cent of federal money, so it shouldn't have impacted them at all. You know, the IRS wants to end the partnership. I mean, we never got a bleeding penny from the IRS, so who cared? I mean, you could have still done every tax return. And in fact, I'm self-critical. I think the mistake, now I'm like obsessional about self-sufficiency. I was always on a pulpit about this. Now I'm like, you know, this is my disease. I can't, you know, talk to people without, you know, sort of a Tourette syndrome about if you're not building self-sufficient base, you're not going to be able to accomplish social change. I don't care what you're saying. I don't want to hear about your I don't even know how to write a proposal to the foundation anymore, because that's just the kind of work that I'm involved in, which is organizing the poor to have power and make change. Why logically should a foundation or the rich ever have supported that? Well, they did for a little while, and you get lured into it. But, you know, now that I've convinced people in Canada and elsewhere to actually charge, you know, a minimum, you know, ask for a donation for the tax service, well, you know, our members are really like delighted to pitch in $30, $40, $50 to get their taxes done, and they'll come back year after year. And if we charged $100 for housing, I mean, we could have made those programs permanent and funded the organizing at the same time, and we didn't, just because of laziness. I mean, we were getting, you know, bank money was paying for one thing on settlements on CRA, you know, and tax campaign paid for another, and, you know, the big household campaign gave us $2 million. You know, so we weren't desperate for the money that way, and so we just didn't do it. And then when those forces started collapsing around you, and some things were unpredictable. The bank agreements fell under because the banks were all being bailed out by the federal government. Once there was a ban on federal money, they had an argument, a rationale, not anything true, from their lawyers that said we might have to return our, you know, gazillion dollars in bailout money if we honor the agreement to ACORN on housing counseling. It was one thing after another, but so that's, you know, I take a lot of lessons from that we just didn't build deeply enough and securely enough to be able to survive. And secondly, that clearly we also never solved the problem of how to embed the organizing methodology and techniques so deeply in our members that they could keep it alive themselves. And that's a puzzle. That's a problem in organizing. That it can't be, you know, it's the labor movement's problem now too. I mean, you can't be that staff intensive. If you, at the point you can't pay for the organizers, people like me, if that's what you have to depend on, then the day is coming when it don't get done. Joel and I spent years trying to think about doing a book about an alternate organizing model. And I'm still a huge believer in it, as I'm sure he is. We haven't had a chance to really talk yet, but it's all based on the notion that you have to turn around the existing model from being such a minority-based model. I mean, it's only representing, I mean, y'all at CALS know these numbers very well, but we're not 1 out of 12 workers, if we're stinking wet and want to lie about it just a little and say we're over 8% of private sector workers are in unions. I mean, the upside is we, you know, 100 million plus people, right? 110 million or so that are unorganized. I mean, so you could talk to just about anybody and have a good chance they're working and not in a union. So, but we don't have the methodology to give people enough of an understanding of how simple it would be to build an organization and then act collectively. Call, you know, whatever you call yourself, you're a union, and take charge of these things and make a difference. We've gotten into such a you know, methodological nightmare in terms of whether it's board or non-board or rules or non-rules or whatever, that we've taken away the ability for workers to build power. And we're in danger of doing that on the community level as well, although we never had as acculturated a model. So yeah, I mean, that's part of the lesson I learned, is we just have to do something very much different. Question?
What about the attempts to build at the state level, and state level organizing? I mean, some of those have been around for a long time, but then post-ACORN, there's lots of attempts to do. I mean, is that What are your thoughts on that level of organizing?
So ACORN began in 1970. 1970 it turned out to be a changing time, but there was an era of a war on poverty, model cities. There was still some interest in whether cities lived or died. So when we started expanding outside of Arkansas in 1975, we could go to cities. And for many years this was true. I mean, we could impact Texas if we had organization for our constituency, lower income, moderate income families. If we had organization in real density in Dallas and Houston, we could leverage something in Texas, and you could jump over Texas to the federal side. And that was true in New York. You only had to be in New York City. You had to only be in Miami, really, to do Florida. You could get away with being just in Chicago. You didn't have to be statewide. Part of the problem of devolution meant that those federal resources that you could try to leapfrog into to move money and resources to win, substantial infrastructure and other improvements in your neighborhoods, around job development, so many things didn't exist anymore. Once the federal money started moving to states in block grants, unless you built up a organization strong enough at the state level. So we were forced, particularly in the last dozen years or so when I was at ACORN, to drastically reframe, in my view, what we had to do to respond to maintain the same effectiveness as a membership organization. That meant we had to have 13 offices in California and 8 offices in Florida and, 8 offices in Texas. We had to really have a statewide organization that could act in that way, and that's what allowed us to do the living wage campaign and so many other of these issues. As long as power works that way, there have to be very strong state organizations. And we also could operate nationally. I don't know that you can not operate nationally. And I think if you looked at those state organizations that we formed out of the ACORN experience, they're only surviving at any level where there were sufficient outside resources. New York, California, certainly. I was just with people in Philly and Pittsburgh, but they're still, a quarter of the size they were, and it's still on the model that, I hold a lot of responsibility for that I'm not sure I'd be willing to argue is what you should do again. I mean, are you waiting for the same thing that you saw happen to you that made you pull the plug on ACORN in 2010 to happen to you in New York or California? Because if the support for that organization is still, external support, I just don't think that's a sustainable model. And so I'm all for them, and I just visited in Ohio with, I mean, you're familiar with this. I don't know if anybody else is. The Mahoney Valley people and Kirk Noden and all the Ohio collaborative people, and I think some of these statewide formations are very, very interesting. But once again, they're all based on outside money, and Kirk and their operation, there's not a dime to dues in any of that. So maybe there's some churches paying here and there, but that's hard wind blows. I don't know that those buildings stay up.